As we traverse dangerous waterfalls, clearly this is an opportune moment to ask, what is the best way to paint horses in 1/72nd scale? And I will answer that question shortly, just as soon as we're out of imminent danger.
Painting horses! Life is full of surprising turns. 1 minute you're at home and the next you're traversing the frontier, trying to establish a new colony for the imperialists.
Come on, Betty, come on!
But in miniature wargaming, there is one constant. Space Marines. Oh lord, sometimes I don't want to be saved. I want to embrace nihilism and the aesthetics of self-destruction. But then, here we go again. Space Marines are on the scene again. The one force that made a difference 900 times before are about to make a difference again, intervening against my will with their 3+ armor saves. Feffing Space Marines, they're just everywhere. But if you're a miniature wargamer and you don't play with or against the Space Marines, which make up a significant proportion of the demographics of wargaming armies, at some point you've probably seen one of these. Or if you go outside and there's a land war across the Rhine or something, you might see a couple of them, but they're a rare sight in large numbers because they've been replaced by one of these. And wars nowadays are less like this and more like this. And in my house, they're like this. But miniature wargamers like their historical accuracy or thematic consistency, so sometimes you will need to paint a horse. There's very few situations in life where someone goes, shit, I need to paint a horse now. But yeah, miniature wargaming is one of them. But first, for some horse facts, because that's why we're here. Horses are useful things, like for the sport of dressage. If you buy one, you'll need a big garden so they can run around. Children tend to like horses, but they're also vulnerable to the deadly force of their kicks because they're small. If a horse kicks a child, they're going flying, like with the sheer force of the kick. It will probably send them hurtling like a javelin at the Olympics. Or like a ragdoll, which, you threw out the window and which then collides with a car. You will not have a child anymore if the horse manages to kick the child. I'm just saying. They don't call it horsepower for nothing. I don't kick children, and if I did, it wouldn't kill them. So I'm infinitely better than a horse. Or at least I possess less killing power. I go to the gym to increase my killing power. That's the reason I go. If you educate your horse properly, it can enter a profitable career and possibly even make it to Hollywood. But money and fame may lead to a magnification of ego and distortion in morality and life goals. And the next thing you know, they're starting a land war across the Rhine, trying to relive the glory days of the charge of the Light Brigade. But war is not the answer. Friendship is. Principles of painting horses. Let us talk in broad strokes. A horse might seem intimidating because you're like, I don't know this shit. With fictional things like dragons or moral billionaires, there's no real life reference, so you can just go to town. But if you make the horse unrealistic, people will find out and then burn down your village. I used to dread painting horses because of this reason. Because I like my village, thank you very much. So when painting a horse in miniature form, I encourage you to Google image a horse and see how the markings go, what color the snouts and hooves are, and how the eyes are alien and completely not like our eyes at all. Just chilling. Lifeless orbs, Or, you can just go out and buy a horse. But once I roughly know what a horse actually looks like, I would then proceed so I have that good reference point. Horses are made of large, flat areas, so you'll need to have a lot of coverage for your paints. Hence, it is important to thin your paints so your finished product doesn't look too blobby or lumpy. Plus, you use less paint if you water it, so you get more value out of each pot. So, painting a horse is like painting most miniatures. Models look better with more layers of colors to simulate granulations of light. So the more layers you do, the better the end result will look. As long as you don't do this. And the large flat areas let you have the space to have many layers. I've tried simulating the hair or coat of the horse by stippling or by making my highlights jagged rather than clean, but I did not like the end result. So I think highlights look better when they're clean, so that is the approach that I've adopted. I will now go through every horse color that I've done, which should cover you for most of the horses that you want to paint across a range of periods. I want to stress that I think painting guides should not be followed without an idea of flexibility. You can substitute paints for similar tones, and you can get great results. The paints I use are just the paints that I have accumulated in my collection, so using modern equivalents will serve just as well. The way I've ordered my chapters in this segment is by simplest to most complicated. That way, whether your brain is smooth, or you embody the ideals of the song Complicated by Avril Lavigne, great song, you should be able to make some use of this. Step-by-step painting guides for individual horse colors. Dominant white. To paint a dominant white horse, I have two methods. One that uses a grey base, which achieves a purer white color, and one which uses a cream base, which achieves a more earthly look. My first recipe base coats the horse's skin with Ulthuan Grey. Then I mix Ulthuan Grey with Codex Grey and apply it to the recesses in the muscles for more contrast. Then a layer of white is applied on top of the raised areas. My second recipe is to base coat the horse's skin with bleached bone and then layer with white, with the most solid coat on the raised areas, and then using more watered, less pigmented coats the more recessed the muscles are. So you can dry brush or use less coats the more you go into the recesses, but the key is to go from more pigment to less, leaving only tiny amounts of bone showing in the recesses. Here the paint is a little too thick. You should thin your paint. My pot was having problems with thick consistency, but I can pretend that it's textured hair or something. Grey, depigmented to white. To paint a grey that has been depigmented to white, I use a bleached bone base all over the model. Then I painted Codex Grey into the recesses of the muscles. Then I layered white as a thin layer across the whole model, and the thinness will allow the previous colors to show beneath the white. You can even think of it as a wash if you water paint down enough. That's what I like to do. Then highlight white onto the raised areas until it is a solid coat. I don't have work in progress shots of these horses because they were the first horses that I painted. Carmelo. To paint a Carmelo horse, I have two methods. The first achieves a brighter, whiter result, and the second is very slightly darker, but effectively looks the same. My first recipe is to base coat with bleached bone, layer the raised areas with white. I then used bleached bone to blend the raised areas more with the bone, which is to get the color gradient right and to fix mistakes. Then I highlighted the most raised areas with skull white again. The key for this recipe is to ensure that there is enough bone showing so the horse doesn't look dominant white, so you want more bone. My second recipe base coats the horse's skin with bleached bone. Then I paint Commando Khaki into the recesses of the muscles. Then I layer white on top of the raised, bleached bone areas, leaving some bone pigment showing in the less raised areas. Light Palomino. To paint a light Palomino horse, I use a similar method to painting a Carmelo horse, but with a tinge of yellow. My recipe base coats the skin with bleached bone, then highlights the raised areas with white, blends the white and bone areas with a watered bone layer where the two colors previously intersected, and uses bone to touch up any mistakes and ensure the recesses have a pure bone color. Then I mix desert yellow and bleached bone and paint a small section of each recess to denote the deepest part of it. I paint over this with a watered, thin pigmented bleached bone to blend the colors together. Gray. To paint a grey horse, I use a dark grey base coat as a foundation, then I use a lighter grey, like Codex Grey, as a highlight on the raised areas. Then I use dots of white on the very highest areas, which can be blended with the lighter grey to ensure a smoother transition. Dark bay. To paint a dark bay horse, scorched brown is used as a base coat on the skin, Then bestial brown is applied as a highlight on the raised areas. I apply a secondary highlight of a mix of scorched brown and white atop the bestial brown. I paint black into the recesses, blending it into the scorched brown. I apply dots of white on the very highest areas, at times blending parts of the white into the brown to ensure a transition effect. Black. To paint a black horse, I have two methods. One that is tinged with brown, which is a standard black appearance, and one that is tinged with blue, which appears to be more mystical or mysterious. My first recipe uses a scorched brown mixed with black as a first layer atop the more raised areas on the horse's skin over a black undercoat. Leave the black undercoat in the recesses of the muscles. Then apply a very thin pigmented layer of bestial brown on the highest areas of the horse flesh. The surface area should be very small in comparison to the first layer. Then shade the bestial brown with a thinly pigmented white. Sometimes the white can look too white, in which case blend the white area with a tiny amount of bestial brown at the edges. Then dot the center of each white shaded area with pure white. My second recipe uses a Codex Gray, enchanted blue, and black mix as a layer atop the more raised areas on the horse's skin, leaving my black undercoat in the recesses. Or you can use Adeptus Battle Gray, enchanted blue, and black as a substitute. I then add more gray and enchanted blue into this original mix and highlight the first layer. Then I mix more gray into the recipe and highlight the second layer. I then highlight the third layer with Codex Gray. I try to blend Codex Gray into the previous layer on the edges. Then I dot the very highest areas with white. I proceed to blend the edges of the white with Codex Gray and wash the white area with watered down, low pigment Codex Gray. Then I dot the whitish area with a smaller dot of pure white, leaving the edge of the previous whitish layer showing. If the horse looks too grey instead of black, I'll blend the edges of the grey layers with black. Bay. To paint a bay horse, I have two methods. Both methods produce a similar effect, using the same core colors in different orders. I have ordered these methods from least to most complicated. My first recipe uses a base coat of bestial brown, then washes the recesses of the muscles with Devlin mud, then highlights the raised areas with bestial brown mixed with desert yellow. I then highlight the previous highlight with desert yellow. I blend the edges of the first highlight with snakebite leather into the bestial brown. I wash the edges of the first highlight with a watered down, low pigment bestial brown to keep the horse looking primarily brown. I mix white and desert yellow and apply it on the most raised areas. Then I dot the center of the previous highlight with pure white. My second recipe uses a base coat of bestial brown, then washes the recesses with Devlin mud. Then I mix snakebite leather and bestial brown into a broad highlight of the raised areas. Then I use snakebite leather as a second highlight of the first highlight. Then I mix desert yellow and bestial brown as a third highlight. I then use desert yellow as a fourth highlight. I use watered down, low pigment bestial brown on the edge to blend all the stages together. I highlight the raised areas in even smaller coverage areas with white mixed with desert yellow. I use desert yellow to blend the edges of the previous highlight with the layer below it. I use a watered down touch of bestial brown over the previous desert yellow blend to keep the horse looking brown. Then I dot the very highest points with white. Chestnut. To paint a chestnut horse, I have two methods. The first method is brighter and appears to be more red. The second method is more brown. In my first recipe, I use a base coat of scorched brown, then I highlight with dark flesh. I paint large white areas atop the dark flesh. I use a watered down, thin pigment dark flesh and wash the white areas. I use a dot of white in the middle of the previously washed areas. For my second recipe, I use dark flesh as a base coat. Then I mix dark flesh with bestial brown and apply that as a broad highlight, leaving the original dark flesh in the recesses. A highlight of bestial brown is applied on the first highlight. I use a watered down low pigment dark flesh to wash and blend the second highlight into the first highlight. I use snakebite leather as a third highlight on the raised areas. I use a watered down low pigment dark flesh to wash the third highlight to ensure the overall horse has a chestnut look. Then I dot white onto the very highest areas. I blend the edges of the white with a wash of watered down low pigment dark flesh into the previous layer. I dot pure white into an even smaller surface area of the original white area. Palomino. To paint a Palomino horse, I base coat the skin with snakebite leather. Then I layer the skin with desert yellow, leaving snakebite leather in the recesses. I highlight the more raised areas with a mix of desert yellow and bleached bone. Then I highlight the first highlight with bleached bone. I then use a watered down low pigment bestial brown to wash and blend the recesses with the more raised areas. I use bleached bone to blend the bestial brown wash into the skin. I highlight the highest areas with white. Pinto. There are two types of Pinto horses, piebald and skewbald. To paint a piebald horse, I paint the raised areas of black patterns with a base coat of a mix of scorched brown and black, leaving my black undercoat around these areas. Then I highlight the raised areas with a smaller coverage area of white. Then I wash the white with a watered down low pigment scorched brown. Then I use black to blend the brown areas into the surrounding black to keep the overall tone of the patterns black. I use a dot of white onto the highest points of the black patterns. To paint the white patterns, I use a base coat of bleached bone. Then I layer this with white. To paint a skewbald horse, I paint the colored pattern scorched brown. Then I highlight the more raised areas with a mix of scorched brown and white. Then I highlight the first highlight with white. I wash the white with a watered down low pigment scorched brown. Then I use a dot of white on the highest point of the colored patterns. To paint the white patterns, I use a base coat of bleached bone. Then I layer this with white. Dapple Gray. To paint a dapple gray horse, I have two methods. The first method is brighter, while the second method uses darker patterns. Both methods require the use of freehand patterns on the skin, but such patterns are rough and irregular, so can be done without too much neatness. For my first recipe, I base coat the grey parts of the skin with Adeptus Battle Grey, while leaving some black patches of skin. Then I use Codex Grey to create splotches and small irregular shapes on the existing grey parts and on some of the edges of the black patches. I use a mix of Codex Grey and white to paint more splotches and small irregular shapes without pattern on the grey parts, leaving all previous coats showing. Then I use a white to make more splotches and small irregular shapes without pattern on the grey parts, leaving all previous coats showing. In my second recipe, I use a base coat of Codex Grey on the skin. Then I paint white dots that concentrate on most of the higher areas of the horse, such as the back, and become sparser towards the bottom of the horse. I paint small, black, angular, oval-like shapes near the legs, rising up to the midway of the body. Skin markings, faces, hooves, and eyes. Sometimes you will need to modify the base skin tone of the horse for various markings, the most common of which are facial markings and leg markings. Different horses have differently colored and shaped markings. The best course of action is to look at images of the horse you are trying to replicate and copy those markings. Black legs and white socks are quite simple to paint. I just dry brush black or white onto the legs, leaving a transition at the edges. I highlight the black markings with Codex Gray. For face markings, I use white to paint different patterns. Some horses have pinkish skin around the eyes and the mouth, wherein I use a dry brush of dwarf flesh, leaving a transition at the edges. Some horses have blackish skin around the eyes and mouth, wherein I use a dry brush of black around, leaving a transition at the edges. Sometimes I use Codex Gray to blend the black into the surrounding skin. For the gums and tongue, I use dwarf flesh. For the teeth, I use bleached bone. For hooves, I have many different recipes because hooves come in many different colors. I have ordered them in order of least to most complicated. I paint Adeptus Battle Gray onto the hooves. I highlight the hooves with Codex Gray. I paint Codex Gray onto the hooves. I highlight the hooves with bleached bone. I paint Graveyard Earth onto the hooves. I highlight the hooves with Codex Gray. I paint Talon Sand onto the hooves. I highlight the hooves with Codex Gray. I paint Scorched Brown onto the hooves. I highlight the hooves with Codex Gray. I paint Scorched Brown onto the hooves. I highlight the hooves with Codex Gray. I highlight the top of the Scorched Brown with Talon Sand. I mix Scorched Brown, Bestial Brown, Codex Gray, and Bleached Bone and apply this to the hooves. Then I highlight the hooves with Bestial Brown. Then I highlight that layer with Graveyard Earth. To paint eyes, I have 3 methods. I use similar techniques to paint black eyes, brown eyes, and blue eyes. To paint black eyes, dot a small circle of white at the upper corner of each eye, facing closer to the ears. To paint brown eyes, shade the lower corner of each eye, facing closer to the mouth, with Bestial Brown or Scorched Brown. Then dot a small circle of white at the upper corner of each eye, facing closer to the ears. To paint blue eyes, paint the whole eye with ice blue, then dot the center with black. Conclusion! So that is how you paint horses. You essentially draw upon real-life references, then you build up paint in layers. It is not as intimidating as you might think. Horses are often essential to many wargaming armies in the ancient, medieval, and early modern periods. So it is an important thing to get right if you want a beautiful army on the tabletop.
As you can see, we have followed the waterfall to its final course of the lagoon, and with no escape left, we face an untimely end. It is what it is. But hopefully with this eventful journey, you have discovered the best way to paint horses in 1/72 scale. I will see you in the afterlife.
This video has been 4 years in the making, 4 years of collecting footage.